Thank you. And I've intentionally left it vague because I wanted to give you my first observations, and instead of anyone having a chance to go look it up and see if I'm wrong first. But you can do that afterwards. And I apologize for the speed. I've got a lot to get through and not enough time. But the paper that my purpose today is that I'm going to suggest that P50 might be fake. This P50, it's a manuscript in Yale. It's a manuscript of Acts. According to Yale's website, P50 was purchased by Michael Ivanovich Rostovtsev from Maurice Nachman in Paris of June 1933. And the only information we have about its provenance is a statement by Carl Kraling in its Edidio Princeps, and that is it's Egyptian. Not too uncommon for manuscripts of that era, but we don't know anything else about it. The papyrus is a bifolio containing Acts 8:26 through 32 and Acts 10:26 through 31 in an unusual non-continuous format. The two folios are not a sheet from a larger gathering with text missing from lost inner sheets. The bifolio as is preserved is the manuscript in its entirety. This is the whole thing. It's written in columns. I'll be referring to them as columns. This is column 1, column 2, and you can see at this point something happens in the text. That's the end of Acts 8:32. Acts 10:26 begins right here on column 2 and continues out through the rest of the manuscript. So this is the whole thing. It was first edited by Carl Kraling in a 1937 festschrift for Kearsarge Lake, and it was re-edited in 1967 by John Oates, Alan Samuel, and C. Bradford Wells. Stephen Immel conserved the papyrus at some point between 1983 and 1996, and as far as I can tell, that was the most recent conservation. Now, if it is a fake, it's not the only fake in Yale's collections. There are a few others. I admit that none of these bear any real resemblance to P50, but 2 of them were purchased around the same time. So if it does turn out to be fake, it's not the only one that Yale has, and it wouldn't be the only one purchased in that era. There are some anomalies in the manuscript that I want to go through that suggest to me that it's worth a further look. It's worth investigating a bit further. These anomalies concern fiber direction, text avoiding lacunae, ink, letter forms, and a discrepancy between the copyist's apparent knowledge and skill. I want to quickly move through those right now. The first one I want to deal with is fiber direction. Now, at this point, it's especially relevant at column 2 here. And the issue is that when we look at the papyrus fibers, they are correct. It's as if Stephen Immel conserved the papyrus correctly based on its fibers, but there isn't enough space in this piece of damage for the text that should be there, particularly with alto. And we'll come back to this alto regularly, several times. It's an important spot. And you can see of my bad illustration, the lines of text are not completely straight. There's really not enough room for the text that needs to go there, but the papyrus fibers are more or less straight. However, if we presume forgery and we digitally separate things out just a little bit, one possibility could be that the papyrus was warped when it was first inscribed. The copyist wrote the text over this piece of damage that was already there, and then when Immel conserved it, he conserved it correctly on the base of the papyrus fibers, but since that's not how it was written, things didn't line up. And when we digitally adjust things, we see that the lines of text are fairly straight. There's room for the letters that go through here, but the papyrus fibers come in at an angle and come out straight. And question we have to deal with is whether the papyrus fibers came in at an angle and came out straight originally, and in the ensuing centuries, some damage just happened to occur right here at the point where the directions change, or if this could be the work of a modern copyist. Second issue is text avoiding lacunae. At this point, there was a square piece of papyrus missing at the end of a line. This is column 3. You can see lines 16 and 19 continue on, but lines 17 and 18 move to the beginning of the next line. And there's no loss of text right here. This demonstrates that this bit of papyrus was already missing when the papyrus was inscribed. It's at the edge. That's not itself a huge problem, except that it's not the only place where the ink conveniently avoids lacuna in the papyrus. Around the same spot, we have a missing papyrus horizontal fiber, but there's also a crack where the papyrus has been folded. You can see as the crack goes through here. But at this new, the text goes up, and for the rest of this section, it avoids that crack. It's clear that the writing's not avoiding the missing horizontal piece, which was missing when it was written, as you can tell through here, but it's actually avoiding this crack that runs above it. Is it more likely that the papyrus was already folded in antiquity when a copyist wrote on it, or could this be a modern copyist who has found a blank sheet of papyrus that's been folded and has written over it? Or could an ancient copyist have written the papyrus and then it just happened to fold at a point where the text avoided this crack that resulted from it? Another example is of the line spacing. Here's one example of it. Here we have 3 lines in column 3, and you can see that these top 2 are more closely together than the bottom 2. When we ignore the descenders, is it more likely that an ancient copyist copied these 3 lines and spaced them out unevenly, and then in the ensuing centuries, damage just happened to occur at the point between the 2 lines that were already a little further apart? Or could a modern copyist have written this line a little lower to avoid having to deal with this bit of damage? Another example we get to is that alto that I mentioned earlier. You can see that before we get to the alto, the lines are evenly spaced, but at alto, the text drops. And these 2 lines are much closer together than the 2 above it. And the word seems to go under that bit of damage. Now, is it more likely that an ancient copyist happened to drop the alto a little bit down here, adjust where the line is going, and continue writing, and then in the ensuing centuries, damage just happened to occur right above it? Or could this be a modern copyist who has a papyrus that's already damaged and is subtly trying to avoid having to write through that damage? Additionally, there are some letter forms that look a little suspicious. So if we go back, this epsilon is the one I want to point out. I don't think the alpha is an example that's relevant. I think that could just be poor papyrus quality. But if you look at these epsilons, here is a good example of an epsilon. If we back up, you can see that the epsilons often come all the way across in the top and the bottom. But right here, sorry, it doesn't. It's like it finishes a little early. The thing that makes this suspicious is that this is line 2. There originally, presumably, would have been a line of text above this, which suggests to me that this bit of damage should not have been there when the papyrus was originally written. So is it more likely that an ancient copyist happened to write this misshapen epsilon and then later damage would occur just at the edge of it? Or could this be a modern copyist? We get the same thing with, at this point, this alpha is the sigma and eta, the upsilon. The damage comes right to the edge of the letters, but doesn't really affect the letters. My favorite one is this nu right here. One of my favorite letters in the whole papyrus. You can see what a normal nu looks like in P50. This doesn't really look like that. Looks more like an eta instead of a nu. Should be coming down and much more narrow right here. But the damage to the papyrus conveniently fits all around the nu without getting in the way of the ink. So is it more likely that an ancient copyist wrote this misshapen nu, and then in the ensuing centuries, the damage just happened to come right all around it, leaving the nu itself? Or could this be the work of a modern copyist? The same with this nu down here. It happens to fit just perfectly between these 2 points of damage. A final example, I mentioned the epsilons that come all the way out in both the top and the bottom. Here is one that stops a little short, and you can even see a point at which there isn't ink at the papyrus. So was this damage already there earlier? is this a misshapen epsilon that was written in ancient times and damage just happened to come right to the edge of where the bottom of that epsilon is misshapen? Or could this be a modern copyist? Another example is how lines are spaced. You can see that up here where the papyrus is less damaged, the lines are more compact, but where there's more damage to it, the lines are more spaced out. And the reason I mention this is that one of the fake papyri in Yale's collection does the exact same thing. We know this one's a fake, and where there's more damage to the papyrus, the lines are more spaced out. Where there's less damage, the lines are more compact. And that's a way to avoid having to deal with writing through damage as much as one would need to. Some observations on the ink are relevant as well. At this point, I want to point out some particles on the papyrus surface. There's some reddish brown particles. And the reason I point this out is that this is one of the phenomenon observed in the post-2002 Dead Sea Scrolls. One of them had modern salt crystals under the layer of ink. Admittedly, these reddish brown particles are not modern salt crystals, but it's the same idea. In this lambda and omicron, we can clearly see that the ink goes over these particles. The tau and omicron avoid the particle fairly well. It nicks the side of it here. That looks difficult to say right here, and at these 2 points, it almost looks like the ink came first. So there were particles on the papyrus surface. The copyist did write over them in at least 2 instances. Is that more likely to be the case with an ancient copyist using a poor quality papyrus, or could this be a modern copyist who's found a blank sheet and is doing the best he or she can? Ink bleeding, I won't spend too much time here, but again, this is one of the things that was noticed in the post-2002 Dead Sea Scrolls. At least one of them that was on papyrus had ink bleeding fairly badly. And you can see that there has been some ink bleeding here, but it's not quite the same color as the ink. It's almost as if someone has scraped a bit of the ink away. Is that what we would expect from an ancient copyist, or is that something that might be better explained by a modern copyist? If we get into retouching, Stephen Carlson in his book Gospel Hoax writes that even more suspicious than the forger's trimmer is retouching. This is a sign of an unskilled copyist, or simulated writing, you could describe it. And it's where the copyist knows what the letter is supposed to look like, but isn't really able to get it just right. And so he or she goes back over it. It's not something that we would really expect from someone who was used to writing in a fluid manner. We don't usually touch up our own letters. But here we can see that's been done with a beta. There's the lighter ink underneath the darker ink. A nu, there's traces of it, and an alpha as well. This alpha and mu have been retouched. And we can see this omega here, it looks unnatural. The copyist has really struggled to go back and try to get all of the bits in. There are anomalies with the hand as well. I will mention just a few of these. One of these is this looks like a modern upsilon. Normally the upsilons in this NP50 are this downward looped shape. Most of them are. But at the end of the line, which is a potential place of distraction, there's this thing, and it looks like a modern upsilon. Potentially, you can see this shape with a descender, but there is, I think, one example of this shape with a descender in the papyrus, but most of them, especially the one in this word, are this downward loop shape. Here's one that looks modern though. These 2 examples of punctuation after met are particularly important. This almost looks like a modern semicolon type of punctuation. And one of the editors mentions that after P50, he did not know of a semicolon being used for a question until the 9th century, which does seem suspicious. Now, as it turns out, both of these points occur at a question in the text. You can look it up in the NA28, but obviously the NA28 wasn't around when this was purchased in 1933. So I checked Tischendorf's 8th edition, and at both places, Acts 8:31 and Acts 10:29, we have meh ending with a semicolon. So it is punctuated in modern critical editions with a semicolon to denote a question at both of these places. So the punctuation doesn't look right for a 4th or 5th century papyrus. Here's an unusual fee. I did find one example of a fee made in this sort of single looped way. But also here is an omega, but it doesn't look like it's the whole omega. It occurs right at that big damage point in the middle of the papyrus, and there's no trace of a loop of a first half. So again, we have to ask the question, is it more likely that a copyist created this omega, did not include any evidence of looping around here, and the damage just so happened to take away all traces of the first half? Or could this be a modern copyist who has papyrus that's already damaged and thinks, I only really need to create the second half of the omega because that's only the papyrus that's there? Finally, there is a discrepancy between the copyist's knowledge and skill. In this short amount of text, there are 14 corrections. The editor, Carl Kraling of the Editio Princeps notes that the nomina sacra are correctly written in standard forms, punctuation and diacritical marks are used correctly, and the scribe's orthography, though not above reproach, is at times better than that of the great 4th century codices. Now, you've seen examples I've shown you of the hand of this papyrus. It's not a well-practiced hand. This is not the hand of a skilled copyist. And one of the markers of an unskilled copyist can be poor orthography. And yet here in this manuscript, the orthography is at times better than Codex Vaticanus. Is that what we would expect from an ancient copyist who was as unskilled as this one? One of the editors points out these 5 unique readings. 4 of these are readings that if you were going to create a fake and you wanted to give just enough differences to make it look a little genuine, right? The text can't be too perfect. Kai ha and ha de, it doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure out that that's a reading that you can create. The same with dropping a syllable here, or adding a dative here, or even substituting proselphon for prosdramon. Those are the kinds of changes that a text critic could be able to think of. This first one is a bit more complicated. I think there is an explanation. I don't have the explanation, but I have something like it, so bear with me. If you were looking at this point and thinking, I need to create a new reading here, let's look in the critical apparatus and see what the options are. There are 2 readings involving hutos in verse 32 a little later, and in verse 27 in the NA28. So it's possible that at this point, this is the reading that should be there. And instead of substituting de or te, a copyist skipped a line and saw hutos. That could be a way that this reading could have originated. But again, the copyist seems to know really well how manuscripts are made and seems to be very unskilled at making one. The text itself has a huge anomaly in light of the 14 corrections, the retouching, which all the good orthography all paint the picture that the copyist is someone who knows what a good literary manuscript should look like and is intent on making them, is concerned with getting the letters to look as good as possible, to get the orthography right, to get the readings right. At the end of the first pericope, the sentence isn't finished. It's a citation from Isaiah 53:7, and the manuscript reads, as a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and as a lamb before the one shearing it was silent, ... That's it. The sentence isn't finished. And even that final word, aphonos, silent, comes as a correction. A line ending the first pericope happens before that word was added. So it seems difficult to explain all of these anomalies with an ancient copyist. The damage just happening to come up at the right spots. the concern for orthography, the number of corrections. The 1967 editors write that the most obvious suggestion, especially in view of the many corrections, is that this was a school exercise, but the hand is not that of a schoolboy, and the corrections were made by the original writer. They conclude their discussion, it is mysterious. Now, in light of the observation that the hand is not the hand of a trained copyist, but it is the hand of someone who is well acquainted with manuscript conventions, could a better explanation be that the manuscript might be fake? If it were fake, it could be produced by someone who knew manuscripts really well, but wasn't necessarily experienced in making them. At this point, I want to have a short interlude. So far, I've suggested by all these reasons that the manuscript might be fake. I'm not 100% convinced yet, because if you step back and look at the hand, ignore the anachronistic punctuation, ignore the modern upsilon and occasional things, the variations between each letter do seem pretty normal for a 4th or 5th century documentary hand. If you ignore the anomalies, the hand looks better than we would expect a faker to be able to create. That being said, there are some anomalies that do need an explanation, and I would love to get this thing under a microscope and look especially at how the ink is behaving around those lacunae. That's one of the things that was done with the Museum of the Bible Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you read the big report and watch the video at the Museum of the Bible's website, you see that was a very important factor in deciding that those were fakes, as well as how the ink behaved was not consistent with what we see in ancient manuscripts. Now, moving forward, I'm saying it might be fake, it might be not, but I still want to make it entertaining and give you a possible forgery. At any rate, a spicy accusation makes for a more interesting paper. And so if you will indulge my reasoned speculation for the remainder of the time, I want to suggest if the manuscript is a fake, who could have done it? Now, if P50 is not an authentic Greek New Testament manuscript, it would not be the only one included in the Kritzka Fausta. Archaic Mark, or Codex 2427, is an infamous example of one such manuscript. However, before it was proven to be a modern production, there were doubts about its authenticity. Kirsop and Silva Lake never completely committed to a position on its authenticity. Now, according to a letter from Chuck Benison to E.C. Caldwell, Silva Lake was asked again about Archaic Mark in June of 1970. And when she was asked, she still would not commit to a position regarding its authenticity. Remember, this is before it was proven to be a modern manuscript. But she did remark, it's either a 14th century or a 19th century forgery. And if a forgery, either a serious attempt or a spoof by someone like my husband. Perhaps Silva Lake's comment reveals more than she intended at the time. Kirsop Lake was a New Testament textual critic and Harvard professor who certainly had the means and opportunity to produce P50, and according to his wife, he may have had the motive as well. By 1970, she did not seem to think it had been beneath her late husband to make a fake manuscript as a spoof. Silva Lake and Kirsop's daughter Agnes were two of the 3 editors of Lake's Festschrift in which the editio princeps of P50 was published. If it was a fake, she certainly would have known about it. There are a few aspects that do point to Lake as a possible scribe of this manuscript. The first is that it was published in a Festschrift to Lake. Now, how better to honor someone who liked a good joke than to take one of those good jokes and publish it as if it was genuine. But not only that, the text is right for Lake. It's a manuscript of Acts that came onto the scene as the final volumes of Lake's 5-volume work on Acts that he edited with Folks Jackson were being published. This is the Beginnings of Christianity series. Lake wrote in the preface to the translation and commentary volume of this 5-volume work that he thought the original text of Acts was more like Codex Vaticanus than Codex Bezae, but that occasionally Codex Bezae preserved original readings against Codex Vaticanus. Now, as it turns out, This general position that Lake had on the text of Acts describes precisely the textual affiliation of P50. It's a manuscript of Acts that looks like what he thought a manuscript of Acts should look like. Additionally, there is one textual anomaly that might point to Lake, but I admit this is speculative. The hand is uneven, but we are fairly certain that what we have is the whole manuscript. So line 1 should be line 1 of the manuscript, but there's not enough room at the end of line 1 to fit all of the text that should be there for line 1. The manuscript starts at Acts 8:26, and the angel of the Lord spoke to Philip. The ECM reports only minor variation there. Now, the text at the end survives, but the beginning of the line is lost to Lacuna. John Granger Cook writes that it's possible that the word angel should be given as a nomen sacrum. That would make better use of the space and could solve the problem. That is one possibility, but there's another. As early as 1915, Lake had written in an article that he referred to the apparent exchange of usage between spirit and angel in the Lord in the story of Philip. The story of Philip is this story. It's the text that's in P50. And almost 20 years before P50 was purchased, Lake is on the record saying he thinks spirit and angel are more or less interchangeable in the story. Well, if we reconstruct the text based on the handwriting elsewhere in the manuscript, but slip in the nomen sacrum for pneuma instead of angel, it fits. It's the right text. It makes use of the space. Lake not only said this in 1915, but he also said it more recently in the commentary volume in that Beginnings of Christianity series. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a discrepancy between the knowledge of the copyist of P50 and his or her skill. The papyrus was clearly written by someone who knew normal manuscript conventions, but was not well practiced as a copyist. Kearsarge Lake, as its copyist, would explain this discrepancy. He was certainly familiar not only with manuscripts, but also with various readings and what to expect regarding scribal error. He is the kind of person who could have created the differences from the text that we see. If P50 is a fake, it is a brilliant fake. One useful thought experiment is to step back and think, what kind of manuscript would you want to create in the 20s or 30s that had staying power? Well, ideally, this would be a small manuscript, because the larger it is, the more chances there are of messing up and leaving a tell that someone is able to catch. The format should be unusual enough that it can't easily be compared to anything else, but at the same time, it shouldn't be so unusual that it attracts too much unwanted attention. Now, the format of P50, 2 non-continuous excerpts from Acts on a single bifolio, does exactly that. The text can't be too unusual. Can't say anything about Jesus having a wife, for example. But also it shouldn't be too clean. It shouldn't be too perfect and too early, like archaic Mark, for example. Either of those would draw too much attention to the manuscript. And likewise, its date should not be so early. It shouldn't be claimed to be a 1st century manuscript of Acts, for example. Date has to be late enough that it doesn't attract a lot of attention. In short, if one wanted to create a fake manuscript that had good chances of not being exposed, this is exactly the kind of manuscript one would create. It's the sort of papyrus that might be cited for only a few variants, not in itself enough to change anyone's opinion on the text in any of those places. It's the sort of manuscript that could sneak into a critical apparatus and then be forgotten. It would take an exceptional mind to conceive of the perfect fake, but Kearsarge Lake may have just been that exceptional person. He lived at the right time, and he fits the bill perfectly for the kind of person required for that task. And his wife did not seem to think that such an endeavor was beneath him. If P50 is a modern production, Kearsarge Lake had the means to make it. With regard to motive, I can only repeat Silva Lake's comments again. She certainly did not think it was beneath her late husband to create a fake manuscript as a spoof. And with regard to opportunity, well, Lake had that as well. His time spent in and around Egypt is well documented. In addition to his work at St. Catherine's Monastery, Lake places himself in Cairo both in 1927 and again in early February 1930 from his own published writings. And that does not include his unpublished correspondence that I have some of and haven't sorted through all of yet. Some conclusions. Well, there are anomalies to P50. There are some things that seem to be better explained by a modern copyist than by an ancient copyist. Places where it looks like damage to the manuscript was already there before the text was written. The way the papyrus fibers don't line up at the point where there happens to be damage on the manuscript. They don't leave enough room for the text that needs to go there. Some misshapen letters. However, at the same time, it does look like a 4th or 5th century hand. It's an excellent job. It's not the same quality of fakes as we normally see as fakes. This is a step above the rest. So I propose that it be examined further, perhaps get it under a microscope, or if radiocarbon dating is a possibility, if a date range of an 8th century papyrus comes back and the paleographic date range is 4th or 5th, that's a big red flag. Still, I'm not 100% convinced, but I am highly suspicious. P50 may indeed be a genuine, but genuinely bad papyrus manuscript of the New Testament. But in light of its anomalies, might it be a Kirsop fake? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elijah. We applaud you from our respective places in this Zoom chat, and you've given us plenty of material there to take further, and I hope there will be some discussion of the various aspects of this papyrus that you've already considered in such detail. So please indicate. Oh, I see some hands raised. Joey, you have a hand raised, so would you like to go first? I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that talk. It was very very entertaining, very spicy, as you say. Do you know if we happen to have any, I guess, like writing samples of Kirsop Lake's handwritten Greek that we could maybe compare to this, just to see if there are any tells?
Yes. I've tried to look through his letters. There's some, I think, at the University of Chicago, and there's some, I think, at the University of Michigan. But most of that is not in Greek. However, about a year ago, I was in Oxford, and Oxford has a catalog, a handwritten catalog that Lake made when he was, I mean, this would have been 20 or 30 years before P50 before he could have made P50. So I'm not sure how relevant it was. I was very disappointed that his fees are not that looped fee. This is mainly what I was looking at the time. I don't know more than that though, because this is obviously, he wouldn't have used his normal Greek handwriting, and I'm not enough of that kind of paleographer to look for the tells between those. I'm not a good handwriting expert in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. Tom, I see you also have a hand raised. Can you unmute yourself? That's it.
Am I?
Oh, hang on. You need to unmute again. That's it.
Oh, good. Elijah, I thought that was a fascinating paper. And I thought during your interlude, you said, well, if we leave aside this and we leave aside that and we leave aside the other, then it might be genuine. But the problem is that you can't leave them aside. And I think, I'm not sure about whether you've proven the second part of your paper, and I would question that. But I think cumulatively, you've proven the first part of your paper, that this is an exceptionally good fake. My question is, was I right in when I looked, if you had a slide where you showed the alignment, and you showed the alignment of the fibers and the alignment of the writing. But when you aligned the fibers, the writing was at an angle to the fibers on the left-hand side, but was along the fibers on the right-hand side with the lacuna in the middle. Is that not proof positive that this writing was done after the split had occurred, and vice versa?
To me, that was an influential argument. I did send this to a papyrologist a couple of weeks ago, and he responded, "I'm not completely convinced that it was a fake, but the papyrus alignment issue was the thing that gave him the most trouble." He said, "If it's a fake, I think that's the best argument for it." So
because because the only way you can actually get, if the writing is aligned, and that's what you should do when you're putting the material, when you're trying to preserve the two portions. But imagine we had lost the left-hand side, then the writing, if you look on the yellow line that you've put in there, we have the on the yellow line on the top left-hand yellow line, we have the direction of the fibers, and that can be very clearly seen with what are called furrows. Indeed, that underlining has more or less followed a furrow. That could be the result of the furrow affecting the nib. But the alpha followed by the phi, they're cutting across the fibers. But if we go across onto the left-hand side and we look at the epsilon iota, the cross stroke of the epsilon on the just beneath the yellow line is directly in line with the fibers. So that means that these two pieces must have been put together on a piece of board somehow and then written across, because we see that the angle of incidence between the writing and the fibers on the left-hand side is continuous all the way down, and it's the same on the other, but the fibers are not in alignment. How else do you explain that other than that these two were torn and then put back together again? So I think that I think if you actually look at that slide a little bit more, you may actually find that you have a single, you have the proverbial smoking gun. My other question is technical, and this is where I'm completely ignorant. And Richard Gameson in Durham has a piece of very technical scientific kit which allows him to test the chemical makeup of inks without destroying them. Have you thought about using that? I can't even remember that. I saw it working once, and you had to dress up like a spaceman to be in the room while it was being done. But I was amazed at completely non-destructive. So, it doesn't affect, and what he's been able to turn up is amazing. And the parallel to if the forger has gone to the bother of making a genuine carbon soot ink, that carbon soot is itself radiocarbon datable, quite independently of the like, presumably, we've all seen odd sheets of papyrus that have come on the antiquities market. So let's say whoever the forger is, they bought this really good piece of papyrus. It looked right. Yes, you're right. An 8th century papyrus with a 5th century hand, it's still not a perfect argument, but it's a very strong argument. But the actual ink itself, if it's a carbon ink, would give you a much closer dating. I just offer those. And my worrying about, imagine Silva Lake. Could I read her sentence slightly differently? Whoever did this was very brilliant. My husband was very brilliant. It would have to be someone who was very, it doesn't have to be, I think there's an element of, it could be just a way of saying it would have to be someone as brilliant as my husband. So I buy your argument completely. I think you're underselling your argument on the fibers, but I think you're a bit hard. I think the Silva Lake was in awe, of her husband. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. James, you're being very patient there with your hand up, and then I see Peter Rogers' comment in the chat. So we'll have James followed by Peter. Thank you, and thank you, Tom, for your observations.
Thank you, Hugh, and thanks a lot for a very entertaining piece there. I was just wondering about whether he'd looked at the contributor himself to the manuscript, Carl Herman Kraling, who's better known as director of the archaeological excavations. I've just clicked on him briefly in Bibil, in the online version of the bibliography, and it just comes up with two pieces, both of which are really quite remarkable. This is, of course, P50, and the only other thing he published in terms of New Testament textual criticism was the Dura Europos fragment, which is again slightly weird. Have you looked at Kraling at all?
Only very briefly. I really liked my lake theory, even though I agree that I could be wrong. So I spent most of my time chasing that up, and only in the past 2 or 3 weeks did I look at others. I think Kraling is worth looking into. Also, the person who purchased it, Michael Ivanovich Rostovtsev, I think also would be a good person to follow up on as well. He seems to be a kind of person who would have been brilliant enough to pull it off as well. I'm not quite sure if he had the motive to do so, but I think he would have been able to.
Thanks, Elijah.
Thank you. So Peter Rogers observes in the chat, can the unusual arrangement of two non-continuous bits of Acts help us? What other examples do we have of this arrangement in New Testament manuscripts? And if we don't have any, it would be seen as too unusual. If I could append an observation of my own to that, which is to talk, to talk about the very final large blank space on the final folio and parallels for that as well, and what you think might be going on there.
Honestly, I haven't spent a lot of time on that. I know there are some people who think it's an amulet, and that's the best example of what it could be. I think it was Cook who suggested it could be preacher's notes for an early traveling preacher. Again, I'm not sure what the other parallels are for testing the theory that it's preacher's notes. If it's an amulet, it seems to, the text doesn't seem right for an amulet. So I'm to say I've very briefly thought about that, but haven't spent a lot of time looking into either of those questions.
Thank you. And one final observation in chat from Stephen Boyce wonders, what's the likelihood that you examine this under the microscope? Are you hopeful that the further examination you are seeking will be possible, or is it all up in the air at the minute?
The last time I checked was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and Yale's library was still closed to outside visitors. I've mentioned it at CSNTM, and I think it's possible that I might work through CSNTM to try to go in that direction. I don't want to put a number on it and say I'm this % confident that it will happen, but the things that need to happen would be to purchase a microscope, which I've looked into that, and it looks like that may be something that we can do at CSNTM, and also to make it up to Yale and to get permissions to see it as well. What I would like to do if I'm able to do it, is to have P50 as well as the other fake that I mentioned that's in their collection, and probably at least one genuine manuscript, all side by side, to be able to compare all three and to compare P50 against a control on either side of that. Hopefully I can do that.
Super, thank you. Well, what I'm going to do now is stop the formal part of the session there, and thank you, and indeed our other presenters, Matthew and Youngmin, who are all in a line on my screen, which is nice. So thank you for giving us so much to think about in matters papyrological today.